Portuguese football books, our coronavirus reading, we thought we must do a very specific blog on this book, because this is the first book we've kind of fully read. It's quite an easy read as well, and a really great book as well. The book's called 1,000 Miles to Jamor by a Portuguese author called Filipe D'Avellez. It's a bit of a story about the Portuguese Cup. Filipe starts off watching some teams in the qualifying rounds, and then he watches the game at every stage right through to the final at a place called Jamor. I'd not heard of Jamor before, but basically it's the place where the Portuguese Cup final's held every year. It's the national stadium. It sounds like it was set up in the 40s by Salazar. I'm not sure it's Salazar who was the president of Portugal at the time, but yeah, it's also the place where Celtic played Inter in the 1967 European Cup final. What I liked about the book though, we go to a lot of games at Rio Ave, which is great. There's a small group of fans and very passionate about their club. And this book really is about the story of similar fan groups in other towns in Portugal. So the story starts in the qualifying rounds where Filipe goes to watch some games in the Azores, really Graciosa. There's also a team called Casapia. He watches a couple of derby games. It's not so much the story about the football game itself. It's more about the fans at the clubs. He meets some interesting local characters. They go to drinks before the games, some restaurants, and there's a lot of stories about the history of the clubs as well. Because when I was in Portugal last time, I was talking to some of the Rio Ave guys, and they were telling me about the ownership of the clubs in Portugal, which is slightly different to in England. In England, they're mainly big companies. In Portugal, they tend to be like associations, and there's fans controlling elements of them. The book tells some story about these kind of organisations, which I've not heard of, called SADs, which seem to be like membership clubs that run them. A lot of clubs, it seemed to me reading the book, sort of merged together at various points. So there's the two stories I particularly liked in this book, well, three really. Three of the clubs he followed in the games. There's a great story about a club which people may not have heard of, called Les Ois. So Les Ois is the port area of Porto. So Porto was a place where, thinking about the late 19th century, a lot of English people went to, mainly to do with the port industry, and that's kind of how football ended up there, like in a lot of countries actually, similar to Argentina and places like that, where English and German immigrants went there and introduced the game. So similar in Porto. But what's great about the story about Les Ois, which has got a great chapter in this book, it's about their club badge, and there's a cricket bat on the badge, which, you know, for any overseas people is a massive sport in England, cricket, and it's about how those influences kind of set the club up historically. Then it merged with other clubs as well. So that's quite an interesting story. And we've actually been past the stadium in Les Ois many times, and often discussed going to a game there when there's been not a local game on, but we never kind of got around to it yet. But it sounds like they've got some really passionate fans who are in Division 2. Great story about them. I think there's a bar they went to, which I need to look up the name of it, but it's something where we probably need to try and head off to before the game. So that's a great story. Also, he talks about a club called Tondela, which we've been to watch a couple of games in Tondela with Rio Ave in the last couple of seasons. Great little ground, quite a small little town as well, but this story about how that club evolved as well. And then there's a great story here about the team that won the cup the year before, called Desportivo de Aves, and their fan group called Força Avense, which is kind of like their little group of ultras. Sounds a bit crazy, but Aves kind of got to the final, won the final the year before, which would have been a very kind of quite a small club. We saw them play this season at Rio Ave. They took a bit of a hiding in the game, to be honest, but great atmosphere there, and obviously a passionate bunch of fans. So a good story about that. A little bit of a story about Aves the year before when they got to the final, or when they played Rio Ave in I think it was a semi-final by the sound of it. I don't really know much about this game, but it sounded a bit crazy. Rio Ave were winning 4-2. let 2 goals in the last minute. The game went to a shootout, and then D'Avellez got through to the final and won it eventually, which was a massive day for them, obviously. This particular book, the final kind of ends up being between Sporting and FC Porto, contest the final in Jamor. What's interesting about the story about Jamor is that it sounds to me like the ground is not used a great deal these days. It's in the middle of a massive forest. The finals day, there's lots of fans in the forest having hog roasts and drinking and things like that. So it sounds quite an interesting place to go to. So we need to kind of make the trip to Jamor at some point when there's any games on there. 1,000 Miles of Jamor is basically the story of some fans of the Azores who were massive Sporting fans and sound like they made the 1,000-mile trip to Jamor for the final. It's a 3-day journey, so that was kind of how the story culminates. But yeah, a great book by Filipe. We got in touch with him, and sounds like he's kind of a bit of a Benfica fan, Lisbon based. So we said we'd try and maybe hook up with him at some point when we're over there and get to a game down in Lisbon, because we've not been to one there for quite a number of years. So thanks, Filipe. Massive plug for the books. If you're a big fan of overseas football, want to find out a little bit about the ins and outs of the culture of Portuguese football, this is definitely the book for you. I think you can get it on Amazon, the English version. I'm guessing if you're in Portugal there's a Portuguese version of this book, but yeah, great one, and 5-star review for this.